The rain hadn't stopped since she left him standing in that doorway, but it wasn't the rain that made her hands shake as she gripped the steering wheel. It was the terrifying, electric feeling of finally choosing herself, and not knowing if she'd survive the silence that came after. Her name was Elena Cross, and at 34 years old, she had just done something she never thought she'd have the courage to do. She had walked out on Daniel, the man she'd spent 6 years building a life with, the man whose ring still sat in a drawer because she could never bring herself to say yes, and the man who, only an hour earlier, had looked her dead in the eyes and told her that her dreams were cute, but they weren't real life. Real life, he'd said, was the mortgage they'd never bought, the promotion he expected her to give up for his career, the quiet erosion of everything she used to be before she became an extension of him. She had listened to him say all of this with a strange, calm clarity, as if she were watching herself from outside her own body, and then she had picked up her coat, her keys, and the small leather journal she kept hidden beneath her side of the bed, and she had walked out the door without looking back. Now she sat in her car outside a rundown apartment complex on the edge of town, the only place she could afford on short notice, staring at the water running down the windshield and trembling rivers, whispering to herself the sentence that would define the next year of her life. I walked out on one man today. Don't make me regret the next. She didn't know who she was saying it to. Maybe to God, maybe to the universe, maybe just to the frightened, exhausted version of herself in the rearview mirror, but she said it like a vow, like something she needed to carve into her bones before she lost her nerve completely. If this story about second chances and the courage it takes to choose yourself is already touching something in you, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to Kindness Corner if you believe, like Elena did, that it's never too late for a new beginning. The first few weeks were the hardest of her life. She had left with almost nothing, a suitcase, her laptop, and enough savings to cover 2 months of rent in an apartment that smelled faintly of old paint and cigarette smoke, no matter how many candles she burned. She had left her job too, or rather, her job had quietly begun to fall apart around the same time, the toxic manager she'd been enduring for years finally pushing her out after she refused, one too many times, to stay silent about being passed over for men half as qualified as her. So there she was, jobless, loveless, essentially homeless in any meaningful sense of the word, sitting on a second-hand couch in an empty apartment, wondering if she had made the biggest mistake of her life. Some nights she would call her sister, Marissa, and cry until her throat was raw, asking the same question over and over: what if I made a mistake? What if I'll never find anyone who wants me the way Daniel did, even if he wanted me small? And Marissa, patient and steady, would remind her gently that being wanted small was not the same as being loved. It took Elena weeks to actually believe that. Grief, she learned, doesn't care about logic. You can know, in your mind, that walking away was the right thing to do, and still feel your body ache every night for the shape of a life you used to have, even if that life was quietly suffocating you. It was during the 4th week, on a gray Tuesday morning, that she wandered into a small, cluttered bookstore 2 blocks from her apartment, mostly to escape the cold and the loneliness of her own 4 walls. The bell above the door rang softly as she stepped inside, and the smell of old paper and fresh coffee wrapped around her like something out of a memory she didn't know she had. Behind the counter stood an older man, maybe in his late 60s, with kind, tired eyes and hands that looked like they had done a lifetime of careful work. His name, she would later learn, was Samuel, and the bookstore had belonged to his late wife, Ruth, who had passed away 3 years earlier from a long illness that had taken pieces of her slowly, painfully, before finally taking all of her. Elena hadn't meant to strike up a conversation. She had meant only to browse, to lose herself in the spines of other people's stories so she wouldn't have to think about her own. But when Samuel noticed her lingering by the poetry section, his eyes soft with something like recognition, he asked her, without any of the awkwardness strangers usually carry, whether she was looking for something to help her feel less alone, or something to remind her she wasn't. She hadn't expected the question to hit her the way it did. She hadn't expected to stand there, in a bookstore, in front of a stranger, and feel tears rise unbidden to her eyes. But something about his voice, steady, unhurried, free of judgment, made her feel, for the first time in weeks, that it was safe to simply be a person who was struggling, without needing to explain or justify or apologize for it. She ended up staying in that bookstore for nearly 3 hours that day, talking to Samuel about nothing and everything, about Ruth and about Daniel, about the strange, disorienting grief of leaving someone who never physically hurt you but who slowly, methodically, made you disappear. Samuel told her something she would carry with her for the rest of her life, that Ruth used to say heartbreak wasn't only for love that ended, but also for the version of yourself you had to let die in order to survive. Elena hadn't realized, until that moment, that she wasn't only grieving Daniel. She was grieving the woman she used to be before she folded herself into someone else's expectations, the woman with dreams she used to speak about loudly and without apology. Over the following weeks, Elena found herself returning to that bookstore almost daily, not because she needed something to read, but because she needed somewhere to belong, if only for an hour at a time. Samuel, sensing her need for purpose as much as company, offered her a part-time job restocking shelves and helping customers, a small kindness that felt, to Elena, like being thrown a rope in the middle of a storm. It wasn't much money, but it was something to build on, something that was entirely hers, untouched by anyone else's opinions about what her life should look like. It was in that bookstore, 3 months after she'd walked out of Daniel's apartment, that she met a woman named Priya, a regular customer who came in every Thursday afternoon looking for used mystery novels, always with a different scarf wrapped around her neck and a warmth in her eyes that made Elena feel instantly comfortable. Priya, it turned out, ran a small non-profit that helped women rebuild their lives after leaving unhealthy relationships, women who had lost jobs, homes, and confidence the same way Elena had. Their conversation started small, about books, about coffee, but eventually deepened into something Elena hadn't realized she desperately needed, a community of women who understood, without needing lengthy explanations, the specific and quiet devastation of choosing yourself when everyone around you expected you to stay small and grateful. Priya invited her to a support circle that met every other Sunday evening in the back room of a community center, where women of all ages sat together in mismatched chairs, sharing stories that ranged from heartbreaking to hilarious, sometimes both within the same breath. Elena resisted going for the first few invitations, telling herself she wasn't in crisis, that she didn't need a group like that her situation wasn't as bad as some of the stories Priya mentioned in passing. But one particularly lonely Sunday, when the silence of her apartment felt unbearable, she finally went. She would later describe that first meeting as the moment she started breathing again. The women in that circle didn't flinch when she described the slow erosion of her identity over 6 years, the way Daniel would frame his criticisms as concern, the way she had convinced herself that shrinking herself was simply what love required. Instead, they nodded, some of them crying quietly, others reaching out to hold her hand, all of them recognizing pieces of their own stories in hers. For the first time since she'd left, Elena didn't feel broken. She felt, instead, like someone standing at the beginning of something, rather than the end of everything. It was through that support circle that Elena met Grace, a woman in her 60s who had left her own marriage of 32 years just 2 years earlier, after realizing, in the quiet of an empty nest, that she had spent 3 decades disappearing into someone else's comfort. Grace became something like a mentor to Elena, someone who had walked further down the road Elena was just beginning, and who could speak with hard-won wisdom about the parts of healing that no one warns you about, the loneliness that comes even after the relief, the strange grief of missing someone who hurt you, the slow and often non-linear process of remembering who you were before you learned to make yourself smaller for someone else's comfort. Grace was the one who encouraged Elena to pick up her old passion again, writing. Elena had wanted to be a writer since she was a teenager, filling notebook after notebook with stories no one ever read, before Daniel had gently, persistently convinced her that writing was a nice hobby but not a real career, not something worth centering her life around. Grace, upon learning this, simply looked at Elena and asked her a question that cracked something open in her chest: if not now, when you have finally, for the first time in years, only yourself to answer to, then when? So Elena began writing again. At first it was just for herself, late at night in that small apartment that no longer felt quite so empty, filling pages with the fear and grief and slow, aching hope of rebuilding a life from nothing. But eventually, encouraged by Samuel and Grace and Priya, she began sharing pieces of her writing online, an anonymous blog at first, documenting her journey of leaving, of rebuilding, of learning to trust her own voice again. She hadn't expected anyone to read it. She had only needed somewhere to put the truth that felt too heavy to carry alone. But people did read it. Slowly, then quickly, women from all over began finding her blog, women who recognized themselves in her words, who commented late at night about their own relationships, their own fears, their own quiet acts of leaving. Elena found herself, for the first time in her adult life, at the center of something larger than her own pain, a growing community of women learning, together, how to choose themselves without apology. Nearly a year after she had walked out of Daniel's apartment in the rain, Elena stood in front of a small crowd at the community center where her support circle still met every other Sunday, having been asked by Priya to share her story with a room full of new faces, women just beginning the frightening, exhilarating process she had started 12 months earlier. As she stood there, looking out at faces that mirrored her own fear and hope, she thought back to that terrified woman sitting in her car in the rain, whispering a promise to herself that she barely believed she could keep. She hadn't known, in that moment, that walking away from one kind of life would lead her toward an entirely different one, not a life defined by another person's comfort, but one defined by her own resilience, her own words, her own slowly rebuilt sense of worth. She thought, too, of Daniel, and found, to her own surprise, that she no longer felt anger toward him, only a quiet, distant gratitude for the version of pain that had finally forced her to choose herself. She would probably never fully understand why some love feels like shrinking and other love, the kind she was slowly learning to give herself, feels like growing. But she understood, now, that the sentence she had whispered to herself that rainy night, "Don't make me regret the next," had never really been about the next man at all. It had been about the next chapter, the next version of herself, the next fragile, determined step toward a life that finally belonged to her. If Elena's journey has moved you even a little, if it's reminded you that it's never too late to choose yourself, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, share it with someone who might need this story today, and subscribe to Kindness Corner so you never miss a story like this one. Before we reach the end of Elena's story, if this touched your heart the way it touched ours while telling it, drop the word "hope" in the comments below, so we know this story found the person who needed it most today. In the end, Elena Cross did not find a single dramatic moment of triumph, no perfect ending wrapped in a bow. What she found instead was something quieter and far more powerful, a bookstore that gave her purpose, a circle of women who gave her belonging, a mentor who gave her permission, and a blog that gave her voice back to the world. She found, most importantly, herself, rebuilt slowly and deliberately from the wreckage of a life that had once made her disappear. And as she closed her laptop that night, looking out at the city lights from her small, finally not empty apartment, she smiled, because she knew, without any doubt left in her heart, that she hadn't regretted the next chapter at all. She had built it, one brave and trembling decision at a time, into something entirely her own.